When we talk about propaganda in the age of artificial intelligence, we are no longer talking about something that moves slowly, something that is carefully crafted over weeks or months and then distributed through controlled channels. What we are witnessing now is something far more dynamic, far more immediate, and frankly, far more dangerous. AI has transformed propaganda from a deliberate process into an instantaneous force. It doesn't wait. It doesn't pause. It reacts, produces, and distributes at a speed that outpaces human judgment. Think about this for a moment. In the past, information had friction. There were barriers, time, labor, verification. Now AI systems can generate realistic war footage, emotional narratives, and persuasive messaging within seconds. And once that content is released, it doesn't just sit there. It moves. It spreads across platforms, across borders, across cultures. Millions of people can encounter the same piece of content almost simultaneously, each one forming an impression in real time. And here's where it becomes psychologically profound. Human beings are not neutral processors of information. We are meaning-making creatures. The first version of a story we hear tends to anchor our understanding. It shapes the lens through which we interpret everything that follows. So when AI-driven propaganda reaches us first, before verified facts, before context, it doesn't just inform us, it frames reality for us. This is what I call the first impression advantage. And in the context of war media, it is incredibly powerful. A viral video, whether authentic or manipulated, can define who we perceive as the victim and who we perceive as the aggressor. It can trigger outrage, sympathy, fear, all within seconds. And once those emotions are activated, they are very difficult to undo. You can correct the facts later, you can present evidence, you can issue statements, but the emotional imprint has already been made. Now consider the scale of this. AI doesn't just create one version of a message, it can create thousands of variations, each tailored to different audiences, different languages, different cultural cues, different emotional triggers. What resonates in one region might be anger, in another it might be fear, in another a sense of injustice. AI can optimize for all of this simultaneously. So what you're seeing is not just propaganda, it's personalized persuasion at a global level. And this changes the nature of conflict itself. War is no longer confined to physical battlefields. It is happening in the cognitive space, in the minds of ordinary people scrolling through their phones. Every viral video becomes a potential weapon. Every share, every like, every comment becomes part of a larger system that amplifies a particular narrative. And most people participating in this system don't even realize it. They believe they are simply reacting, simply expressing themselves. But in reality, they are contributing to the spread of influence. There's also a philosophical dimension here that we cannot ignore. Speed has always been associated with power. The faster you can act, the more control you seem to have. But when speed surpasses understanding, it creates a dangerous imbalance. We begin to respond before we reflect. We react before we question. And in doing so, we surrender a part of our agency. AI doesn't just accelerate information, it accelerates belief formation. It compresses the time between exposure and conviction. And when that happens, critical thinking becomes a casualty, not because people are incapable of thinking critically, but because they are not given the time or space to do so. The system is designed for immediacy, not for reflection. So the real issue is not just that AI can spread propaganda quickly. The deeper issue is that it reshapes how we engage with truth itself. It conditions us to accept speed as a substitute for accuracy, virality as a substitute for credibility. And over time, this erodes our ability to distinguish between what feels true and what actually is true. And that's the moment we need to pause. Because if we don't become aware of this dynamic, we risk becoming passive participants in a system that is actively shaping our perceptions without our consent. We risk mistaking exposure for understanding and reaction for awareness. The question then is not whether AI will continue to accelerate propaganda. It will. The question is whether we, as individuals, will slow down enough to reclaim our role as conscious interpreters of information. Because in a world where information moves at the speed of algorithms, the real power belongs to those who can still think before they believe. Now, if the first shift we explored is about speed, how quickly information moves, then the second shift cuts even deeper. It challenges something far more fundamental, our ability to trust what we see. There was a time when visual evidence held a kind of authority. A photograph, a video clip. These were not just pieces of information. They were treated as proof. People would say, "I saw it with my own eyes," as if that settled the matter. Vision was tied to certainty. But artificial intelligence has begun to fracture that relationship in a profound way. Today, AI can generate videos that are not just convincing, they are indistinguishable from reality to the average viewer. Leaders can be made to appear as if they are declaring war, surrendering, or issuing threats they never actually spoke. Soldiers can be shown committing acts that never happened. Entire events can be fabricated with a level of detail that bypasses our natural skepticism. And this is not just a technical problem. It's a psychological disruption. Because when you can no longer rely on your senses, something deeper begins to shift. Doubt doesn't just attach itself to false content, it spreads to everything. Real footage becomes questionable. Authentic voices are met with suspicion. Truth itself becomes unstable, not because it has disappeared, but because our ability to recognize it has been compromised. This creates what I would call a crisis of epistemology. A crisis of knowing. How do we know what is real? How do we decide what to believe when the very tools we use to verify reality have been manipulated? Now think about the implications of that in the context of war. In moments of conflict, clarity matters. Decisions are made quickly. Public opinion can influence political action, international response, even the course of the conflict itself. But when deepfakes enter that space, they don't just misinform, they disorient. A single fabricated video of a national leader making an inflammatory statement could escalate tensions within hours. Even if it is later proven false, the damage may already be done. Emotions have been triggered, reactions have been set in motion, and as we discussed earlier, once those emotional responses take hold, they are incredibly resistant to correction. But here's where it becomes even more complex. The existence of deepfakes doesn't just allow falsehoods to spread, it gives those in power a new kind of defense. When real evidence emerges, it can be dismissed as fake. This is sometimes referred to as the liar's dividend. The mere possibility of fabrication creates plausible deniability. So now we are dealing with a double-edged sword. On one side, false content can be presented as real. On the other side, real content can be dismissed as false. And in between those two forces, the average person is left trying to navigate a landscape where certainty is constantly slipping away. Philosophically, this raises a profound question. If everything can be simulated, what anchors reality? What becomes the foundation of trust? Historically, societies have relied on shared agreements about what is real. Institutions, journalism, eyewitness accounts, these were part of a collective framework for truth. But AI-generated media is putting pressure on that framework. It is decentralizing the production of reality itself. Anyone with the right tools can create something that looks authoritative, sounds credible, and feels authentic. And here's the deeper psychological layer. Human beings are wired to respond to coherence. If something looks consistent, if it aligns with our existing beliefs or emotions, we are more likely to accept it. Deepfakes exploit this tendency. They don't just present false information, they present it in a form that feels right. And that feeling can be more persuasive than logic. So the challenge we face is not just technological, it's cognitive. It's about how we train ourselves to engage with information in an environment where appearances can no longer be taken at face value. This doesn't mean we become cynical to the point of rejecting everything. That's not the solution. Total skepticism can be just as dangerous as blind belief. What it requires is a more disciplined form of awareness, a willingness to pause, to question, to seek corroboration. It requires us to move from passive consumption to active evaluation. Because the truth is, the tools that can deceive us are not going away. They will become more sophisticated, more accessible, more integrated into everyday media. The question is whether our level of discernment will evolve alongside them. And that brings us back to a very human responsibility. Technology may alter the landscape, but it does not remove our agency. We still choose what we believe. We still decide how we respond. And in a world where seeing is no longer believing, the real power lies in thinking. So as you move forward, as you encounter the next viral video, the next shocking piece of footage, remember this: your eyes can be influenced, your emotions can be triggered, but your judgment, if you choose to use it, remains your own. And in an age where reality can be manufactured, the most radical act is to become someone who refuses to accept appearances without understanding them. Now, once we understand how fast information moves, and once we accept that what we see can no longer be taken at face value, we are led into the next layer of this reality, and that is emotion. Because speed may carry the message and realism may make it believable, but it is emotion that makes it spread. Human beings do not share information simply because it is true. We share it because it moves us, because it triggers something inside us: anger, fear, outrage, sympathy, pride. And artificial intelligence has become exceptionally skilled at identifying and amplifying those emotional triggers. Think about how you interact with content on a daily basis. You scroll, you pause, and something catches your attention. It's not usually the most balanced or nuanced piece of information. It's the one that hits you, the one that makes you feel something immediately. That reaction is not accidental. It is the result of systems that are designed to learn what captures human attention and then reproduce it at scale. In the context of war media, this becomes particularly potent. AI doesn't just generate content, it optimizes it. It analyzes patterns. What kind of imagery evokes the strongest reaction? What type of language provokes the most engagement? What sequence of visuals keeps people watching? And then it refines that formula over and over again until what you are seeing is not just information, but emotionally engineered content. Now, here's where it becomes psychologically significant. When we experience strong emotions, our capacity for critical thinking narrows. This is not a flaw. It is part of our biological design. Emotions are meant to prepare us for action, not reflection. If you feel threatened, you react. If you feel outraged, you respond. There is a sense of urgency built into the experience. AI-driven war media taps directly into that mechanism. It creates a sense of immediacy, a feeling that something must be done right now. And in that state, we are far more likely to share content without verifying it, to form opinions without examining them, to align ourselves with narratives that resonate emotionally rather than intellectually. And this is how polarization deepens, because emotional content doesn't just inform, it divides. It simplifies complex situations into clear categories: good versus evil, victim versus aggressor, us versus them. And while that kind of framing may feel satisfying in the moment, it often strips away the nuance that is necessary for true understanding. AI can take a single event and present it in multiple emotionally charged ways, each tailored to a different audience. One group sees a story that confirms their fears. Another sees a version that reinforces their anger. Another sees something that validates their sense of injustice. And each group walks away believing they have seen the truth, when in reality, they have seen a version of reality designed to resonate with their existing mindset. This creates parallel emotional realities. People are no longer just disagreeing on interpretations. They are reacting to entirely different emotional experiences of the same event. And when that happens, dialogue becomes difficult. Because you're not just debating facts, you're navigating feelings that have already been intensified and reinforced. There's also a deeper philosophical question here about autonomy. If our emotional responses can be predicted, shaped, and amplified by systems we do not control, to what extent are we choosing our reactions? And if those reactions influence our beliefs and decisions, then how much of our worldview is truly self-determined? This is not about removing emotion from the equation. Emotion is essential. It connects us. It motivates us. It gives meaning to our experiences. But when emotion is deliberately engineered to drive engagement, it can be used to steer perception in subtle but powerful ways. So the challenge is not to become less emotional, but to become more aware of our emotional responses, to recognize when something is designed to provoke us, to ask ourselves, what am I feeling right now and why? Is this reaction coming from a place of understanding, or is it being triggered by the way this content is presented? Because that moment of awareness, that pause between stimulus and response, is where our agency lives. In a world saturated with emotionally charged content, the ability to pause is not weakness. It is strength. It is the difference between being driven by the current and choosing your direction within it. And as AI continues to refine its ability to capture attention and evoke emotion, this skill will only become more important, not just for individuals, but for societies, because collective decisions are often the result of collective emotions. And if those emotions are being shaped at scale, then the implications extend far beyond any single piece of content. So as you engage with the next viral video, the next powerful image, the next story that seems impossible to ignore, take a moment. Notice what it is asking you to feel. Notice how quickly it is asking you to react, because in an environment where emotion is engineered for virality, the most powerful response is not immediate action, it is conscious awareness. And when you learn to feel without being controlled by what you feel, you reclaim something essential, the ability to respond, not just react. And when you bring all of this together, the speed at which information moves, the erosion of visual trust, the precision of emotional manipulation, you arrive at a final and unavoidable question: who is responsible for all of this? Because it's one thing to recognize the problem, it's another to understand where accountability begins and where it ends. We are living in a time where the systems that shape public perception are no longer controlled by a single entity. They are distributed across developers who build the technology, platforms that amplify the content, governments that may exploit it, and individuals who unknowingly participate in its spread. Responsibility in this context becomes diffuse. And when responsibility is everywhere, it often feels like it is nowhere. Let's start with the technology itself. The engineers and organizations developing artificial intelligence are creating tools of immense power. These tools are not inherently good or bad, they are amplifiers. They take human intent and extend its reach. But here's the challenge. Once these systems are released into the world, they don't remain in the hands of their creators. They become accessible, adaptable, and in many cases, uncontrollable. So the question becomes, how much responsibility lies with those who build the tools? Is it enough to innovate, Or is there an obligation to anticipate how that innovation might be misused? And if misuse is inevitable, what safeguards should be in place before these technologies are widely deployed? Then there are the platforms, the digital environments where content lives and spreads, social media networks, video sharing sites, messaging apps. These are not passive spaces, they are structured ecosystems governed by algorithms that determine what is seen, what is amplified, and what is ignored. These platforms often operate on engagement. The more attention a piece of content generates, the more visibility it receives. But as we've already discussed, emotionally charged and controversial content tends to generate the most engagement. So there is an inherent tension here. The very systems designed to maximize user interaction can also accelerate the spread of misinformation and propaganda. Now, platforms do attempt moderation. They implement policies. They use AI to detect harmful content. They employ human reviewers. But the scale is overwhelming. Millions of pieces of content are uploaded every minute, and misinformation doesn't always present itself clearly. It evolves, it adapts, it mimics legitimate narratives. So we are left with a difficult reality. Complete control is not feasible, but neither is complete inaction acceptable. And then we come to governments. In times of conflict, information is a strategic asset. States have always engaged in propaganda to influence both domestic and international audiences. AI simply enhances their capabilities. It allows for more sophisticated messaging, more targeted influence, more plausible deniability. This introduces a geopolitical dimension. Different countries may have different standards, different regulations, different motivations. What one nation considers disinformation, another may consider strategic communication. And in a globally connected information environment, these differences collide. So again, responsibility becomes complex. It is shaped by power, by interests, by context. But after examining all of these layers, the developers, the platforms, the governments, we arrive at a point that is both uncomfortable and empowering, because there is one more layer we have to consider: the individual, you and me. Every time we engage with content, we are making a choice. It may feel small, almost insignificant, a click, a share, a comment, but collectively, these actions shape the information landscape. They determine what rises and what fades, what gains traction and what disappears. And here's the difficult truth. Most of this participation happens unconsciously. People don't wake up intending to spread misinformation. They react, they respond, they share what resonates with them. And in doing so, they become part of a system that amplifies certain narratives, regardless of their accuracy. So, the question is not whether individuals have power. The question is whether they recognize it, because awareness changes everything. When you begin to see how these systems operate, how content is designed, how it spreads, how it influences, you are no longer just a consumer. You become a participant with intention. You begin to pause before sharing. You begin to question before believing. You begin to recognize that your attention is not just a passive experience, it is a resource that shapes reality. And that shift from unconscious participation to conscious engagement is where responsibility becomes meaningful. This is not about assigning blame, it's about understanding influence. It's about recognizing that in a world where control is decentralized, responsibility must also be distributed, but it must be owned at every level. Developers must build with foresight. Platforms must operate with integrity. Governments must act with accountability. And individuals must engage with awareness. Because if any one of these layers fails, the entire system becomes vulnerable. And as we move forward, as AI continues to evolve, as media becomes more immersive, more persuasive, more immediate, this question of responsibility will only become more urgent. So let me leave you with this. In a world where information can be created, by machines, amplified by systems, and weaponized in ways we are only beginning to understand. The most powerful safeguard is not technology alone, it is human awareness. Because the moment you stop being a passive receiver and start becoming a conscious participant, you change the equation. And in that moment, responsibility is no longer something abstract. It becomes a choice.